Hey, welcome, folks. Chelsea, let you take it away.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Chelsea Barnes. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Strategy with Appalachian Voices. And welcome to our press webinar for the introduction of our policy platform designed to stop and prevent zombie coal mines. Make no mistake, zombie mines are scary for our communities, our economies, and our health. We refer to zombie mines as the mines that coal companies are still pretending are active and operating, but in reality, these coal mines have been left idled for years, often without the resources they should have in place in order to clean up and reclaim these sites for other purposes. Coal CEOs walk away from these mines, and because of loopholes in the law or lax state regulations, the companies aren't required to clean them up adequately. As coal operators find ways to slide out of their obligations, our communities are the ones shouldering all of the costs created by their messes, whether it's the increased risk of landslides or toxic water pollution. That's why more than 50 organizations have come together to tackle this crisis by providing Congress with a clear policy roadmap. The platform that we are releasing today diagnoses the zombie mine crisis and recommends the tools needed to fight back. We have an excellent panel to talk about these mines and how the platform can help. So to start, I would like to introduce my colleague, Erin Savage, Senior Program Manager with Appalachian Voices.
Hi all, thanks Chelsea. All right. And are we putting slides up? Excellent, thank you, Dana. All right, so I'm going to walk us through our congressional platform and the problems that we're attempting to address. So the first problem we're looking at is the coal bonding system. The way SMACRA is set up, it requires coal companies to provide bonds that would be available to reclaim the mine if the coal company doesn't do it themselves. If this bond system were working as intended, state regulators would have the money to do reclamation. So the zombie mines could be forfeited. The states could take them over and use the money from the bonds to do the reclamation themselves. And we wouldn't have this problem. What we're finding is that the bond systems that have been set up are not adequate. And so states are reluctant to take over mines and do the reclamation because of a lack of funding. So we've suggested a number of changes to SMACRA that could improve bonding practices and make sure that money is available to do reclamation. The first are a couple of kind of big picture changes. So creating a federal fund from fees on coal companies to make up shortfalls in current bonds, or replacing the existing bond system with a more secure government managed trust fund system, so that the trust would be set at an adequate level, they would generate income and be properly managed to fully fund reclamation. Relatedly, adjusting how bonds are set so that the bond amounts are reflective of the actual reclamation liability. A newer issue that we've uncovered is ensuring that sureties that provide bonds are able to cover those bonds. I've put a graph in here regarding a company called Indemnity National Insurance. They cover coal bonds in a number of states. This is from 2022 data, and it shows the percentage of total bonds in these states that are solely attributed to indemnity. So you can see that in West Virginia, at least as of 2022, indemnity covered over 60% of all the coal mining bonds in West Virginia. We feel it's too much liability. Other changes would be adjusting bond release phases to incentivize full reclamation. At this point, too much bond is released too early on, and coal companies tend to stall out sort of partway through reclamation. And disallowing self bonds and phasing out pools. A lot of states have already stopped using self bonds, but they are still on the books and could be utilized again at a later time. There are 5 states that still have self bonds in place. Several of the eastern states utilize pool bonds where companies share liability across a pool, but that pool doesn't actually cover the cost of reclamation for all the permits taking part in the pool. And then lastly, improving bonding for long-term water treatment. Current bonds are not set up to deal with long-term water treatment when it arises. All right, next slide. The next problem is coal companies not conducting contemporaneous reclamation. SMACRA requires contemporaneous reclamation, but it's not well defined, and so it's hard to enforce. We would like to define it in an objective manner so that it's enforceable. Relatedly, companies often place permits in what they call temporary cessation or idled status. So we would like to limit the amount of time that permits can remain in this idled status. Also related, ensuring compliance with the Clean Water Act through reclamation, require disturbed areas to be planted with non-invasive species. We see a big invasive species problems both in the East and the West, and require temporary cessation status to constitute a significant permit revision because that would trigger public participation. All right, next problem. 3 is permit transfers allow companies to shed responsibilities. We've seen many bankruptcies over the past 7 or so years, and many of those bankruptcies result in permit transfers between companies. And so this could provide an opportunity to make sure that these other coal companies taking on permits out of bankruptcy are actually capable of doing the reclamation before that transfer is approved. So it would close loopholes that allow out of compliance companies to create new subsidiaries and take on permits as well. What we see is companies creating multiple subsidiaries so that the problems of one subsidiary don't limit the ability of a different subsidiary to obtain new permits. And this basically gets around a key part of SMACRA, which is that if a coal company is a bad actor, it shouldn't be allowed to get more permits. And we need, that original intent to actually work. All right, and next slide. Back one, thanks. Okay, and then the last problem is companies and regulators are not planning for mine closures. Mine closures are at least initially dealt with through the permit application for the whole mining plan, but mines have a long lifespan and things change, and often these mine closure plans need to be updated to make sure that coal companies are actually putting together a reasonable plan for how they will get the reclamation done, how they'll fund it, how they'll have materials to do the backfilling and regrading. And changing the way we deal with mine closures could increase public participation and transparency and just really hold coal companies accountable for putting together a sane reclamation plan. So that's a broad overview. We'll give you guys a chance to ask questions on the platform later on. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Shannon Anderson, who's a community organizer and staff attorney with the Powder River Basin Resource Council.
All right, thanks, Erin, and greetings to everyone out there. So I'm speaking to you from the state of Wyoming, and our organization, Powder River Basin Resource Council, focuses on coal mining impacts within the Powder River Basin and across the state of Wyoming. So I thought I would ground us a little bit in place to start with. So this is a picture of the Powder River Basin landscape, and it really shows the diversity of vegetation, topography, and really what we're trying to restore back to when we have large landscapes impacted by coal mining. So the idea that these landscapes are critical for wildlife, they're critical for communities, livestock grazing, recreation opportunities, particularly on the Thunder Basin National Grassland. And so we have really spent a lot of time trying to encourage coal companies to do better reclamation, faster reclamation, and to be able to restore our landscapes for the multiple use purposes of which they are intended. So yeah, go ahead and do the next slide. So the scale of Western mining is very different than Eastern mining in that we have fewer mines. We have about a dozen in Wyoming, but they're incredibly large. They're the largest mines in the world. And they're also taking place in a very arid landscape that has, it's difficult to reclaim, difficult to reestablish vegetation, and really, important for us to kind of focus on what reclamation is in that kind of a landscape. So we really believe these recommendations today have a lot of potential to bring our landscapes back into post-mine status, particularly better defining contemporaries reclamation would do just amazing, it'd make an amazing difference for us on the land, just here in our land. And also making sure that we address the size and scope of reclamation that happens here in Wyoming. So for here in Wyoming, you know, Erin talks acres, OSM Marie talks acres. Not everyone talks farmers. So, and particularly for our landscape scale, I put things in square miles because we all drive. We kind of know what a square mile is. So 308 square miles in Wyoming have been destroyed by coal mining. That's roughly the length of our state from top to bottom. And then you kind of put a square mile on that length of the state. So it's a significant amount of acreage. Of that, only 53 square miles have obtained final bond release and reclamation status. These metrics have been improving, but they're definitely still lagging behind where they should be after 40 years of mining. Our bond release has been increasing recently because of new regulations that have limited the use of self-bonding within Wyoming, but self-bonding is still allowed under certain circumstances. Wyoming mines have replaced all previous self-bonds with third-party surety bonds, and many guaranteed by significant collateral. And that has created an economic incentive to seek bond release and carry out reclamation work necessary for that to happen. Over the past few years, this has meant record amounts of reclamation and bond release here in Wyoming, as well as incentivizing creative new ways to set aside reclamation funding at the company level. Both Arch and Peabody now have sinking funds with reclamation costs set aside and dedicated to carry out reclamation through the end of mine life. So when you have bonding that is effective and creates that financial incentive, companies not only do more reclamation work, but they also prioritize reclamation at the company level. And so we know that bonding and reclamation solutions that we've proposed in this platform work based on experience here in Wyoming, and frankly, just common sense across coal country. So now we just need regulators and policymakers to put them into place. And I will turn it over to Rebecca Shelton, who is the Director of Policy at Appalachian Citizen Law Center.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, and hi all, thank you for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should care about mine land reclamation from a community and environmental impacts perspective, as well as ground some of these issues within the state of Kentucky where we are based. Next slide, please. So unreclaimed mines can result in a lot of harmful consequences, some of those being excess water runoff from the site, loose boulders, landslides, unabated high wall hazards, and contaminated surface and groundwater. You know, for example, a 2022 Bloomberg article told the story of red water running off of a former Love Branch mine in Kentucky, such that it ruined actually a former miner's septic system and collapsed his dining room floor. There are other instances and cases of mines, such as Lexington Coal's Crescent Mine in West Virginia, that committed more than 30 violations for damages related to failing to control runoff and letting boulders roll downhill, all of which are unpredictable and hazardous. Oops, not quite finished. And then the last thing is high walls. As you can see in this photo, it's small, but that cliff face that you see is a high wall. And it's exposed, unstable rock that is subject to rock falls, or even you can imagine driving an ATV or some other vehicle on the mountain and not knowing that cliff was just a few feet away and potentially at risk of going over the edge. And some of these mines have thousands of feet of unreclaimed high wall. Next slide, please. Another consequence of these mines is potentially their intersection with increasingly severe flooding, particularly in the Appalachian region. And especially in some of the recent floods in West Virginia and Kentucky, there has been a growing attention paid to the intersection of mined landscapes and the severity of flooding. Researchers have found that runoff from surface mined areas is more similar to the amount of water you would see coming off of a paved urban landscape than a deforested but otherwise unmodified area. And that's due to the severe compaction that takes place during reclamation and also the lack of soil and absorptive capacity when a mine is being mined. And there have been several lawsuits that have been filed against mining companies in the region for exacerbating the impacts of flood events, and engineering studies that are submitted as evidence in those cases have supported the claims that large mines have increased severity of local flood events. Next slide, please. There's also an economic cost of failing to reclaim mines. When production, coal production, and reclamation work are both idled on these sites, the mines are not contributing to the economy. Reclaiming the mine sites, that reclamation itself can put people back to work in areas where many layoffs from the mining industry have already occurred. In 2020, the Western Organization of Resource Councils estimated that the workforce needed to complete surface mine reclamation across 7 Western states, the Navajo Nation and the land of the Hopi tribe, would create between 6,000 and 12,000 job years. And Appalachian Voices completed a similar analysis in 2021 across 7 Eastern states and found that reclamation could create between 23,000 and 45,000 job years. And in addition to the economic potential benefits of the economic impacts of reclaiming these mines, keeping mines unreclaimed can also prevent economic opportunity, as they can't be used for any alternate uses until they've been reclaimed and their bonds released. Next slide, please. So in Kentucky, the policy platform described by Erin could help address many of the mine reclamation issues that we're experiencing, and I'll give just a couple of examples. One sort of clear example, both because of the gravity of the bankruptcy, but also just because of the amount of information that was revealed and available through those bankruptcy proceedings, is that of the Black Jewel bankruptcy, and that occurred in the state in 2019. And that bankruptcy process revealed some of the issues that Erin discussed about the inadequacy of bond amounts on many of the company's permits. So when that bankruptcy was going through the courts and the state regulators were assessing the cost to reclaim 33 permits that were going to be forfeited, they estimated that the cost to reclaim those sites for the state was 28 million more than the amount of bond coverage available. The case is also an example or an illustration of what can happen when there is not sufficient oversight in the permit transfers process. You know, Black Jewel was built from permits that were acquired through bankruptcy, and the company was essentially paid to take on mining permits that had a lot of outstanding reclamation liabilities, and then which subsequently accrued thousands of violations. And last, as Erin showed earlier in one of her first slides, you know, Kentucky has a very high amount of unreclaimed mine acreage. And we know, based on a recent report that our organization published, that many surface mines have idled production in Kentucky and are not making expedient progress on reclamation. Our analysis showed that nearly 40% of surface mine permits that are classified as by the state of Kentucky as being in active status have not produced coal since 2020. And those permits cover approximately 12,000 acres in the state. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and I will pass it over to our next speaker, Jizelle Torres from Prairie Rivers Network in Illinois.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jizelle Torres, and I am the Climate and Energy Program Assistant at the nonprofit Prairie Rivers Network in Illinois. Prairie Rivers Network's mission is to protect water, heal land, and inspire change, alongside with being an Illinois affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation. We have worked with coal communities for decades on issues related to water pollution, and today we are also supporting those same communities with new cleanup and economic opportunities thanks to funding and support from recent state and federal laws. The economic futures of Illinois coal companies communities and communities across the nation are dependent on the sufficient cleanup of abandoned and modern mine lands, including the addressment of water pollution. We are thankful for the leadership of our Appalachian partners like Appalachian Voices and Appalachian Citizens Law Center, and we are excited to support policy reforms that will ensure adequate reclamation of modern coal mines to protect communities and our environments. Illinois is mining more coal today than we were 20 years ago, making us the nation's fourth largest coal producing state. Despite this, the state's industry often flies under the radar of state leaders and organizations, and rural downstate communities are often left with little support in understanding and addressing the environmental safety and health problems that past and ongoing coal mining presents. The topic of zombie mines and modern mine reclamation in Illinois are not as well studied as in Appalachia. That being said, we do know that as of 2022, 32,500 acres of current coal mines in Illinois required cleanup. Of this, 6,600 were partially reclaimed. At the time, available bonds totaled at $419 million, and Indemnity National Insurance Company covers $284 million, or 68% of all bonds in Illinois. Indemnity provides coal reclamation bonds in at least 11 states and is the largest single provider across those states. It has taken on nearly $2 billion in bonds for multiple permits for multiple mining companies across multiple states. This means that the bankruptcy of even one large coal company could put the financial health of the company at risk, threatening the operation and reclamation of many mines. In particular, Indemnity is highly exposed to mine abandonment from the Black Jewel bankruptcy in Kentucky and Virginia, as Rebecca touched on earlier, to the ERP Environmental Fund receivership case in West Virginia. State regulators in those states have expressed concerns that Indemnity cannot afford to meet its obligations to pay out bonds at mines already experiencing financial distress. Federal policies should ensure that surety companies are able to cover the bonds they provide, and we are excited to support proposals to address this. Surface and groundwater quality problems exist at closed, idle, and active coal mines and pose significant reclamation problems. In 2022, there were only 15 mines actively producing coal in Illinois, but in the same year, there were at least 35 mines that had Clean Water Act permits that were not in compliance. When unexpected surface and groundwater problems arise at coal mines during reclamation, bond amounts are often not sufficient enough to address the problems. Our state agency in charge of reclamation and bonding lacks sufficient tools ensure that funds are available for water pollution cleanup or long-term water treatment. If needed, federal policies should improve compliance with the Clean Water Act at the coal mines during and after reclamation, and alternative bonding and financial mechanisms should exist to ensure water pollution cleanup and long-term term management when needed. Bond forfeitures have caused reclamation problems in Illinois at sites like the Murdoch Mine in Douglas County and Eagle 2 in Gallatin County. As the coal industry declines, concerns are growing about the future of companies in Illinois and potential bankruptcies. For example, Foresight Energy, the owner of 4 massive underground mines in Illinois, went through bankruptcy proceedings in 2022. Foresight mines have long histories of worker safety, health, and environmental violations, and the massive coal refuse impoundments associated with these and other underground mines pose long-term concerns for communities in Illinois. Federal policy reform is needed to ensure that bankruptcies do not allow companies to shed reclamation on other liabilities. Once again, thank you to the leadership of our Appalachian partners and federal leaders for their work on identifying the problems and solutions that modern mine eras are reclaimed and pollution-free.
Thanks so much, Jizelle. And
Thank you, and I will pass it on to Chelsea.
thanks so much, everyone. And to all the speakers who have joined us today and for your efforts to clean up our coal mines. So going forward, we want our message to Congress to be clear. All people deserve access to clean water and deserve to be safe in their homes and communities, including people living near coal mines. It's time for Congress to address this head-on and enact meaningful changes to the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act as outlined in our platform. We are grateful to the members of this coalition who have been actively working with congressional offices over the past year to develop bills that will address these provisions of our platform. Those members of Congress that we greatly appreciate include, but are not limited to, Senator Fetterman, Congressman Beyer, and Congressman Cartwright. We are working with other offices as well, and we plan to release bills in the coming weeks and months. Additionally, Congressman Cartwright does plan to reintroduce his Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act, which addresses self-bonds sometime soon. We welcome any member of Congress who wants to help address this crisis to work with us to enact these policies. So with that, I will pass it over to Trey to facilitate our Q&A.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks to everybody for joining. If you're interested in asking a question, please use the Q&A function or raise your hand and we'll take you off mute. I did just want to flag that I threw in the link to our new website, zombiemines.org, where you can see the platform and some other resources. So while folks might be queuing up, we do have one question that in the queue already, and this is from Tom Martin. He asks, what about the Kentucky Reclamation Guarantee Fund? The state claims this fund exists to make up the difference when a bond falls short of the actual cost of reclamation. It's based on basically the same funding source as the Coal Severance Fund, but with the industry's decline, so have those funds. So we're wondering about the financial status of KRGC. Rebecca, is that something you could tackle?
Yeah, I'll take a first go at it, and if others have anything to add, certainly can. Hi, Tom. Thanks for the question. So the KRGF, I'll give a specific example. So I think the current amount of funding is just it hovers and has been hovering around 50 million. And what I referred to in the earlier when I was speaking was the example from the Black Jewel bankruptcy when 33 permits that were going to be forfeited and the company was not going to be able to reclaim. The difference between the bond amounts on those mine permits and the amount of and the cost of reclamation was 28 million. So essentially, if the state had decided to or had to rely upon the KRGF to make up that difference, it would have wiped out over half the funds in the KRGF, just a single bankruptcy alone. And what the state did instead is because that would have impacted the KRGF so much, is they set up instead a reclamation agreement with the surety company itself. And the surety company thinks that they could do reclamation at a lower cost than the state projected that it would cost them. And so right now we are just waiting to see how surety reclamation on those permits progresses, and none of that reclamation has yet been completed, even though the bankruptcy was filed in 2019. And we do know, though, that those surety reclamation agreements and the plans that they are following are not the reclamation plans that were initially put together for those sites. So there have been modifications to the reclamation plans and the requirements. And we're really unsure how that will play out over time and are watching closely to see how that goes.
Thanks, Rebecca. For reporters on the call, if you have a question, please raise your hand or use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Or feel free to throw something in chat if you have an issue. Last call for questions. All right. Well, panelists, are there any closing? Oh, we do have a question. Sorry. It's from Bob Mooney. Bob, I will ask you to you there?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I want to thank all of you. And I've been involved in coal mining reclamation since January 1975 when I became a state inspector and worked for OSM from 78 through 95 when I left and joined USGS doing Everglades restoration. According to OSM, they have just under 5,700 inspectable units. And I haven't seen any of the organizations deal with that listing of inspectable units, which provides information whether they're active, abandoned, forfeited, etc. Although they're not very accurate on which mines are producing coal. Some regions, some of the three regions identify as active producing, but not all three. And I suggest you guys look at that. Also, according to the Energy Information Agency, which does weekly production of coal, there are about 530 active mines as of 2022. And again, I recommend you guys put together a database that's shared. Listening to what each of you have as far as data, but have not combined, definitely warrants that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone want to respond? No, we can, go ahead, Rebecca.
Well, Erin, you or
Sure.
I, whatever.
Yeah, I'll respond to a couple of points that Bob made. So collecting this data is very difficult. We do use inspectable units lists often when we can get them, when we can get agencies to provide them, as well as state data where states have primacy. But there are a couple of key issues there. One, there aren't very many of us, and it takes a lot of time. Two, when we do collect this data, it's a snapshot in time. And so as soon as we've collected it and analyzed it, it's already old. So one thing we really want to see is the regulators, both state and federal, publicizing the data and making it more readily available, drawing conclusions from it so that it's not up to a couple of citizen groups.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, the Kentucky report that I referenced, we did use the inspectable units list that the state creates and paired it with production data from OSMRE, AML severance reports, as well as MSHA protection reports to look at the state of some of these active mines. And so it is something that we use actively. And I think the other thing that I'll say that I'll reference is that part of our advocacy was asking the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to conduct a comprehensive study of these issues across the nation. So using the available data that OSMRE has, they will look at the production status and reclamation status of mines across the country, as well as outstanding liability. And that report from GAO is expected next summer. So that will help further inform the kind of how to make the policy tools and the solutions as precise and as hard-hitting as possible.
Yeah, and I would just add that part of it is a need for consistency across states and just better kind of baseline metrics of what we're even looking at in terms of what's idle, what's active, how regulators treat those two statuses. So that's, we're hoping the GAO can really dive into that and really sort of identify how the agency is doing it currently and ways that the agency can improve tracking that information so we have better transparency and accountability.
Thank you all. We have one question in the Q&A. I will read it out loud. Surety bonds are regulated in part through Treasury, including the underwriting limit requirements. Do you plan to propose regulation changes to the Treasury seconds or just SMACRA? I know that's mentioned in the platform, but would anyone like to take a crack at the specifics?
That's probably an Erin question to start, but I'm happy to help too.
Thanks. I was going to say, I'm happy to start, but I would appreciate any attorney input. Yeah, so that we're aware of that regulation. We have reached out to Treasury before with not a lot of results. That regulation is for sureties doing business with the United States government, so it doesn't specifically actually apply to coal bonds. Those are essentially a private agreement between the surety and the coal company. However, we know of several states that do reference some of these Treasury regulations in their state regulations for surety bonding. So it's kind of used as a guidance, I'd say. But what we found is there's some limitations even for individual policies that seem to be disregarded. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of communication between state regulators or OSMRE to actually look at aggregate liability, aggregate amounts that companies are covering. So, unfortunately, it doesn't apply real well here. We don't have current plans to work outside of SMACRA, but we are always thinking of brainstorming about possible solutions.
Yeah, I would add, we have
Shelton?
asked for, changes to Treasury's regulations. And so a group of our organizations has commented to Treasury and in recent regulations they have proposed on sureties to implement an aggregate limit. So effectively an underwriting limit that's not just per bond, but actually per company or per sector. So it looks at, say, like Indemnity National, and it says, here's your total, underwriting coverage across the coal sector. Because that's the real issue, is that each individual bond is okay and it's on itself with that underwriting limit. But when you take how many bonds are, bonded by indemnity across the coal industry, the company just doesn't have that much asset. So it would really, if indemnity was called upon, it just wouldn't be able to do the reclamation work necessary to reclaim those mines. I would note in the West, because we have federal coal and because the federal government is actually a co-guarantor of, or receiving party of our bonds. So it's the state agency and OSMRE are actually on our bonds. And because that it is a bond with the federal government, and therefore it is required to use those underwriting limits for any mine with federal coal resources. But if you have a mine without federal coal resources, as Erin says, it is just kind of guidance and could be probably implemented a little bit stronger across different states. Again, the underwriting limits are good. They're updated annually. That's important. But they don't take that kind of big picture look at the aggregate for the industry's liability.
All right, well, thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to all of our panelists for making time today. As I mentioned, the platform is available now at zombiemines.org, and we'll be sending it out shortly with a press release. But if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me, and I could connect you with any of our panelists. But thank you very much for your time, and have a great Thursday.